So we can see people are coming in now. 62 have arrived.
Nice. Settle for that.
71.
Can you see who they are? Or are they just numbers?
Yeah, I can actually, yeah.
One good thing, you know, at least doing it on this, no one can throw anything if they don't like it. I can see why that music's royalty free.
Five so far.
Okay.
So I'll be starting the webinar in about 2 minutes. Thanks for coming. Okay, it'll make a start. People have still around 136 so far. Maybe I shouldn't tell you the numbers, we're about 150 now.
Right, okay.
Good evening from southwest France. Okay, I'll make a start anyway.
Okay.
So I'll control it. That's fine. You don't have to do anything.
I change the slides there.
Yeah, you can change the slides.
Okay. Nice. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Yes, your eyes aren't deceiving you. I am on mute, but I'm not on mute. I'm actually joined by Howard is in my kitchen, so we're both here, and you can actually hear me through Howard's computer. We'll put mine on mute so it doesn't confuse matters. So welcome everybody to the IET Northwest Midlands event for this evening. And yeah, so we were hoping that we would be able to start having a face-to-face event, but not quite yet. I think we were a little bit jumping the gun, so we're still having an online event. But the good thing is that currently we have 170 participants, which is fantastic news. So my name is Sam Wayne. I'm the chairman of the IET Northwest Midlands. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all this evening. And I'm going to pass over to Howard in a moment. I am driving the computer for Howard. And what I will also be doing is checking the chat. And I'm really pleased to see that we've got quite a lot of chat messages going on. And that's brilliant. The chat isn't just for me, it's for you all to chat amongst yourselves as well and share anecdotes. And I see that we've had a few anecdotes about Lucas have been shared already, actually, Howard, which is great.
Yes.
So what I'd just like to remind you that if you've got any questions, and I will read out the questions at the end of the session, do put the questions into the Q&A rather than the chat, though, please. So I'll monitor the Q&A. And the good thing about having the Q&A is people can vote for questions as well. So people should be able to see the other questions and then up them or agree with them as you see fit anyway. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn on Howard's camera. If you just bear with me a second. We're doing it lo-fi here. There we go. So, there we go. We can see Howard. And I will switch off my camera in a moment, okay, Howard. And great stuff. So actually, without further ado, from the other side of my kitchen, socially distanced right here is, let me introduce Howard Evans. So thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for the introduction, and welcome everybody. Thanks for attending. My talk tonight is about Lucas, and I should just perhaps explain that I've been in the motor industry for 50 years in total. For half of that time, I've worked either for Lucas and one of its successor companies. For the other times, Lucas's customers. So I've been able to see the company from both sides, and I hope therefore have a fairly objective view of things. But I think it was, and still is to some degree, a great British company. So tonight, I'm going to summarise that. It will be clearly a brief summary because it was a large and complex organisation. And I'll do it nominally in chronological order, starting from the origins and working through to the conclusion. So without further ado, I'll kick off. Right, I would if the screen would move forward.
Right arrow.
Oh, it's different from mine, okay.
Or maybe click with your, just I'll make sure that we highlight it.
Right,
yeah,
okay,
there we go.
right, right, okay. So we're now, oh, well, right, okay, thank you, Sam. Okay, Sam mentioned there'd been some chat already. I suspect some of them probably about Lucas jokes. So I thought I'd try and get those out of the way first. Then go on and talk about Joseph Lucas himself, the founder of what I've termed the family. And you'll see when we come to that why I'm using that description. I'll then talk about cyclalities, a strange word, and followed by motoralities, an even stranger word, but I'll explain why when we get to those. Then talk about how Lucas saw the First World War and the success that came out of that for them, through the interwar years, and then into the Second War, and then bringing things up to date to the end. During the presentation, I'll highlight some of the technical aspects that I think are worthy of comment, some good, some bad, some opportunities lost, and then reach a conclusion. It won't be conclusions as in my thoughts about things, just the conclusion of the story. So I hope that makes some sort of sense as we go through. So yes, the jokes. Here's a good selection of them. You've probably seen them all before, but I think the one on the left, the bottle of Lucas smoke, is quite close to home because I used to work for Lucas wiring companies, and it's probably caused by people using the one on the top right, the guy into fuse replacement. Like a lot of things, these reputations are very quickly spoiled and take a long time to recover. And I think in truth, there was some justification for these jokes and the reputation of Lucas being questioned in this way, mainly coming from the cars that were sold in America during the 1970s, particularly Triumph and MG sports cars. So I've got them out of the way, but I think when I come to this part of the presentation, possibly I'll give some reason and understanding why these stories grew out of those particular cars. So, by the way, my favorite Lucas joke isn't on here. It's perhaps more subtle, and it's simply a question. Is girling a verb? Anyway, let's move on. So I've called this an extended family business, and this is the reason why, really. If you look at these are the, what we probably call now the CEOs of Lucas. So from Joseph, the founder, it was taken on by Harry, his son, and then Oliver Lucas, his grandson. So direct family linkages there. But in 1914, Peter Bennett joined the company, and we'll explain why as we go on. But he and Oliver Lucas worked together from there on, right through till after the Second World War. And they were really instrumental in growing Lucas into the company it subsequently became. But following Oliver and Peter Bennett, there was Bertram Waring, again appointed by Oliver Lucas, Kenneth Corley, who was previously his PA, Bernard Scott, again appointed by Oliver Lucas, Godfrey Messervy, worked all his life for the company and was related to the Lucas family by marriage, and Tony Gill, a career spent working for the Lucas company. So until 1994, when George Simpson came along, there was this chronology of and continuity of leadership, which led to a very recognizable Lucas style of business. One was great attention to shareholder value and delivering a dividend, and the other, a very sympathetic and caring approach to the employees. So quite a paternalistic, perhaps, view, and perhaps old-fashioned by today's standard, but nonetheless, it was described from time to time as the Lucas way of doing things. So let's start with the man, Joseph Lucas. He benefited from an education of sorts, which was perhaps unusual for his contemporaries in the working class areas of Birmingham, in that he learnt to read and write at Sunday school with George Dawson, who was a local sort of an evangelistic clergyman. And that served him well in getting his first job, which was with Elkington Silversmiths. Again, a typical sort of role in this area of Birmingham at the time, which was very concerned with metalwork in general. And his first job was an electroplater. He married early and had a large family, and we don't know really why, but he became unemployed and alcoholic. That could have been the result of a completely different outcome. But for some reason, he saw the light. We don't think it was a religious conversion, but nonetheless, he made a decision to give up alcohol and started a business that subsequently ended up as becoming Lucas Industries. He was selling paraffin from a barrow, pushing it around the Hockley area of Birmingham. Now, that area is was very involved in manufacturing small metal goods, things like buckets, shovels, and spades. So it was almost natural that he picked up those sorts of products to sell on his barrow. And then he moved into lamps, and lamps were a very important step because they play a very significant part of the subsequent growth of the company. Also, at the end of the 19th century, it's the booming era for cycling. And so, particularly with lamps and other parts available for cycling, it was a real opportunity for Lucas to expand. And he established and planned for the development of the King Street factory, which we'll talk about later on. Ironically, because he'd become a teetotaler, when he visited Naples in 1902 with some friends and family, whereas the other were drinking the local beer, he risked the water and died from typhoid. I won't try and draw any sort of conclusion from that message, but an unfortunate end to the guy who actually founded the company. Now, I mentioned lamps, and this product was instrumental in making Lucas the company it subsequently became. Joe Lucas didn't design it. It was actually designed by Isaac Sherwood, but he factored it. He sold it from his trolley initially and then moved to sell it more widely. The design was then purchased, and Lucas had seen opportunities for improving the design, and that's typical of the guy, not necessarily to invent something, but see an opportunity to improve something that was already there. And he therefore patented these improvements and used the patent agent Marks and Clark. I mention them because Marks and Clark was a patents agent for Lucas right till the 1990s. I actually dealt with them myself on certain applications. And that again was indicative of the sort of relationships Lucas formed. They tended to be durable and long-lasting. And this was the product that established the Joseph Lucas Company. And it was actually manufactured in the Tom Bowling Lamp Works in Little King Street, Birmingham. Now, you might ask why Tom Bowling and why it was, well, it was a ship's lamp, so maybe, but Tom Bowling is actually the name of the sea shanty. And those of you who listened to the last night of the proms, Tom Bowling is the slow, mournful cello piece, which is part of the Fantasia on the British Sea Songs. So why it was actually selected to name this lamp, I'm not too sure, but there's certainly a nautical connection there. Being into lamps meant that he was well placed to benefit from the growth of cycling. And Lucas had this propensity to invent names for things. And he describes his Lucas cycle products as cyclalities. With this banner, all good cyclists use them. So very early on, he saw the benefits of having a good strapline in terms of advertising the goods. And initially lamps were oil and acetylene, candle lamps, and eventually electric. And perhaps most importantly, for these lamps, he devised the name King of the Road. And that's a name that really stuck with Lucas subsequently and has been used for a number of different products. And even Lucas products that are factored today. I think are still described in terms of cycle lamps as king of lamps. So they're still making that same link to the original product. And you can see on the right a king of the road acetylene lamp that came out of this period of Lucas manufacture. But they didn't stay just with lamps. They got into bells. By the end of the 19th century, they're manufacturing 20,000 a week, pumps, and even kits of cycle parts. Type A was a set of parts you could buy to make a men's bike, and Type B a lady's bike. Joseph Lucas also saw the opportunity for using this business to factor other products. Cyclocam was a camera and stand that you could carry on a bicycle. And he also took out licenses for Brooks saddles. And again, Brooks was a long-lasting company. I remember even in the 1960s, if you were buying a racing saddle for your bike, you always went for a Brooks P17 or something like that. And the success also gave him the opportunity to export into Europe, the USA, the British Empire, and Japan. And again, everything was patented. And that again was significant about Lucas, that all the IPR, as we now call it, was very heavily patented as products were developed. And significantly, in 1895, work started on what would become A Block at Great King Street, which was the Lucas headquarters for many years. Now, I'm jumping forward a bit here. This is a very nice diagram of the total Great King Street complex, probably done by the apprentice in the drawing office over the years. And this shows the site as its fullest extent. Just a few words about the nomenclature. Chronologically, it starts with A and ends up with V, I think. So Block A was the first, Block V was the last. There are 7 floors throughout most of the complex, of which floor 1 is the basement. And so when people said they worked in a particular area, you'd say, I work in M4, and we knew that might be Block M and floor 4. So that sort of nomenclature was used throughout the factory. And if we look at this little bit up here at the top, that was M7. That was the most important part, where the board of Joseph Lucas had its offices. Now, you might ask, why did, oops, what's happening? Sorry, let's go back. You might ask yourself why Block A appears to have started in the middle of the factory, because you might expect it to start on one of the streets or one of the corners. And the next picture shows actually a post-World War II picture of the factory and its locality in Birmingham. And you can see why it started in the centre. If you look here, you can see the Joseph Lucas factory here, Great King Street. This is the original block here with A Block somewhere in the middle. This is the second aspect that was started in the First World War when the Thomson Magneto business joined Lucas. But you can see here, this is how this area of Birmingham was organised in those days. Houses around the periphery, but in the back, where you'd normally expect to have gardens, a number of small workshops. And that's what happened over here. When Great King Street was started, Lucas started in a very little workshop in the back here. And as the company expanded, they bought up and eventually occupied this whole sector here, and then moved across the road, this being Great King Street here, to occupy the block there. So just a slight aside in terms of why A Block started in the middle of Great King Street. But going back to the story, being in cycle products at the time placed Lucas very significantly in a good position to capitalize on the growth of the motor industry. And again, they created this new name, Motoralities, for the products. And the products initially were very similar to those for bicycles, petrol and acetylene headlamps. The volume ones were called Luminator, and the top of the market, King of the Road. Bulb horns, which were mandated in those days. But then in 1909, we saw the first real growth of electric products. Side lights and tail lights, initially without any sort of power source. But then in 1910 at Olympia, dynamo lighting was introduced, and then followed up in 1911 by accumulators. So we were now beginning to build up a sort of lighting system with which we're now more fully aware. In 1911, the electric horn replaced the bulb horns, and most significantly in 1911, the introduction of what was called initial equipment, we'd call it original equipment these days, to car manufacturers. Prior to this time, if you were buying a car, you'd buy a chassis from a particular supplier, you'd deliver it to a coach builder to have the body fitted to it, and then things like lights and other accessories were fitted after the event. They were literally accessories you could select or not. And so the concept of actually having initial equipment, standard stuff fitted to the car, was quite new and very important for Lucas, because it was therefore seen as a route to getting volume manufacture and regular customers. And in fact, the most significant early product and application of Lucas products was in 1913, when they got a contract to supply a 6-volt dynamo and 3 lamps to the Morris Cowley. And that led to subsequent orders from a number of the other automotive manufacturers at the time. So a very significant breakthrough, the introduction of initial equipment. So when World War I broke out, an interesting situation was that 98% of all the magnetos used in Britain were supplied by Bosch from Germany. Internal combustions was used quite extensively, even in those days, in military equipment. And battery and coil ignition was still in the future. So Harry Lucas, Joseph Lucas' son, warned the government of the risks, but was assured that supplies of magnetos would be available from Bosch in America. That didn't exactly turn out that way, but fortunately, Lucas set out to design its own magneto, but in the process acquired Thomson Bennett Limited, who were specialist magneto manufacturers. And this on the right here is one of the products, magneto products, that were supplied from that time. And so Lucas acquired Thomson Bennett and expanded Great King Street to accommodate the manufacture of magnetos. And between 1916 and 1918, 130,000 were supplied to the British government. So a very important strategic move there made by Harry Lucas, seeing a risk and opportunity and capitalizing on it. It wasn't just magnetos that were made. A wide range of products were made to support the military. Interesting ones were Aldis lamps. Aluminium ones were made for the Navy, and rubber ones to be used in airships. On top of that, equipment for tanks, lorries, and armored cars, resulting in that by 1918, Lucas sales were 80% higher than they had been in 1914. So significant progress and growth of Lucas during that period. Now, post-war, as things settled down, the automotive market was developing in the UK, and these were the key suppliers and customers: Lucas, CAV, and Rotex. Lucas had a broad range of customers, from Morris and Ford at the volume end up to Rolls-Royce at the premium end. CAV had Austin volume, and then brands like Kleiner and Lee Francis. But also they had 3 commercial vehicle customers: Leyland, AEC, and Thornycroft. Rotax again had some niche automotive customers, but significantly an aeroplane company, Sopwith. And looking at the relative strength of these companies, well, CAV had licenses for Bosch products, so that gave them a good technical edge. They were quality products, probably following on again from the Bosch reputation, a load of technical innovation, and access to the commercial vehicle markets. Rotex's strengths were they had access to aircraft system customers, instruments, and it was a very well-managed company. CAV were in financial trouble, and it was proposed that Lucas and Rotex would take them over jointly. However, things didn't quite turn out like that. In the event, Lucas paid outright for CAV £321,000 in cash, and they purchased Rotex for nearly £700,000 in cash and shares. And quoting Bertram Waring later, he said, "We got CAV at a bargain price, but we paid in full for Rotex." The outcome of that was that Lucas now had a near monopoly of the UK car manufacturers, and that gave them the opportunity to improve the manufacturing scale and volume, although Rotex and CAV remained commercially separate for some time. It also gave Lucas an entry into the commercial vehicle and aircraft component businesses, which they hadn't had before. And the subsequent growth of Lucas Automotive and Aerospace really started from that diversification of the business at that time. Between the wars, there were other acquisitions. Powell and Hanmer, a big cycle accessories business. Albert Risk Limited, a manufacturer of coils, horns, and bulbs, and a big supplier to Ford. Butler Lamps, that was also a supplier to Ford. And Smiths, the lighting and horns business of Smiths Instruments. Now, some of these businesses were actually bought through nominees. I think it was clear even at that time that Lucas was becoming a monopolistic supplier to the British automotive industry. So, for example, RIS Limited, which was bought between the war, didn't become publicly known to be a Lucas company until after the Second World War. But this was significant and indicative of Lucas's growth and acquisition of the competitors, as well as organic growth of its own. So between 1920 and 1939, sales had multiplied sevenfold with the expansion of automotive and aircraft industries to £20 million a year. Profits had risen sixfold during the same period, with a dramatic increase in employees from 3 to 20,000. Expansion into Europe and the Far East had also taken place, and patent exchanges and cross licenses had been put in place with Bosch and Bendix. Now, it's also worth mentioning that behind these cross licenses and patents, there were also a number of understandings. We'd probably call it a cartel or anti-competitive situation these days. But for example, there were understandings between Autolite in America and Ford and Lucas that said Lucas wouldn't compete for Ford American business and Autolite wouldn't compete for Ford British business. And as a consequence, Oliver Lucas was given great access to the American market to see the benefits of economy of scale, knowing they wouldn't actually be in direct competition. He also was very good friends with Henry Ford and utilised that friendship to build a Ford business, particularly in the UK. So a lot going on in this period, growth, but also some segmentation of the market and some partitioning that perhaps wouldn't be quite as acceptable these days if people found out about it. So the advent of World War II gave another impetus for technical expansion. First thing that happened was that Bosch and CAV separated, quite obviously, but CAV were now so self-sufficient that they were able to continue developing diesel fuel injection systems themselves. And that put them in great position of strength, both through the war and subsequently. It also gave Lucas an opportunity to expand into a range of equipment for piston engine aircraft, and the braking system company Girling was acquired during that period. Of course, like a lot of manufacturers in that time, industrial companies, manufacture of arms and ammunition was very significant for Lucas. And something that would have great significance going forward was they were involved in the development of the gas turbine engines with Whittle's jet engine program. It was clear at the time that the expertise, project management and technology that Lucas demonstrated and had available could be a significant asset to that program. And as a result, during the war, sales doubled again to over £40 million. So into the 1950s, and Lucas now had what was called GTE, the gas turbine engine business. A prestige project was the engine for the Rover jet car, the gas turbine engine, which showed, like others found subsequently, that a gas turbine engine was totally unsuitable for automotive use. Its major efficiency being running at constant speed, which was not a typical automotive situation. But more importantly, they had a position in aircraft business, both in terms of fuel delivery pumps and combustion chambers for gas turbine engines, jet aircraft engines. And they had established relationships with Rolls-Royce, Armstrong Siddeley, and other turbine manufacturers. So the other thing was that in this period from 1950 to 1957, this was probably the most intensive period for aircraft development in the UK's history, both civil and military aircraft. And Lucas was well placed to capitalise on this. Just to give an example of the almost lunacy of the developments during that period, this was the activity that created three separate V-bombers, nuclear bombers, because projects were given to different aircraft manufacturers in competition, and often all variants were purchased. So it was a real period of unsustainable, as it turned out, expansion, but Lucas was well placed to capitalize on this. They'd got generation and power systems from within Rotax, engine fueling and combustion systems from the gas turbine division, partnership with the engine manufacturers, and they'd purchased Hobson's, who were the flight control systems group within Lucas. So they got access to all the key systems necessary to develop modern jet aircraft. And this situation continued until 1957, when the Duncan-Sands Review rationalized both aircraft manufacturers and the programs, and brought things to be down onto a much more sustainable basis. But during that time, Lucas capitalized on it very well, with Lucas equipment on, amongst others, the Hawker Siddeley Trident, the BAC 111, Vickers VC10, English Electric Lightning, Sud Aviation Caravelle, and the BAC TSR2. And the success of Lucas in this aircraft business eventually formed the basis for setting up Lucas Aerospace in 1971, as all these individual companies were consolidated. Into the 1950s on the automotive side, then, based on what had been seen earlier, there was a drive to achieve US levels of volume through standardization. It had been seen from Lucas's visits to North America how high volume could lead to high productivity and low prices. And Lucas sought to achieve that same sort of manufacturing operation in the UK. Also was seen from Girling the introduction of disc brakes in volume in 1956 on the Triumph TR3. Now, after separating from Bosch, CAV launched its own design of distributed fuel pump. And fuel injection, petrol injection, was developed both for race and volume automotive supply in the UK. Probably the most memorable being the TR6 and the Triumph 2200 TC. Sorry, the 2000 inject PI to PI. So Lucas was well placed at this point to get new technology in the automotive market as well as the aircraft business. To support all this activity, Lucas took a very bold step by setting up the Lucas Group Research Facility in 1965. This is a late picture I have of it taken when TRW had taken the company over. But this was a very bold step and showed a very significant commitment and confidence in the future of the Lucas companies. It was rather, not sarcastically, but rather appreciatively termed the University of Lucas, because it was staffed with some highly competent scientists and engineers developing new technology for automotive, aerospace, medical and defense applications. And that covered all sorts of things. I've just summarized a few here: batteries, torpedo control systems, heart pacemakers. The things I've highlighted in red are things that had very significant and still have very significant impact on the automotive industry. Silicon micro machine transducers, which are now pressure sensors in many applications on cars. Lucas, in the early days, even designed and manufactured its own semiconductors. In the early days, it was seen that electronic ignition was going to be a very big growth opportunity. And at the time, there weren't power transistors available with high VCO and low VCE SAT. And so Lucas set its own semiconductor manufacturing facility up to make such devices. Some pictures on the right. And not only did they make transistors, they also made Zener diodes, power diodes, and large volumes of small signal diodes. So on this occasion, it was seen very clearly that an opportunity was presented and Lucas rose to the challenge. Final thing on this list is just smart fly-by-wires. That was an interesting project that Lucas did for the aerospace division, where to try and avoid the risks of EMC on networked aircraft control systems, they designed and supplied a complete flight control system using fiber optic communication. So the group research facility was a very effective and powerful support for all the rest of the Lucas businesses. Now, by the late 1960s, this vision of high volume standardization was starting to come to pass. 80% of the cars manufactured in the UK use the M35 starter motor, this thing here, and the C40 generator, which is similar in terms of type of machine construction, the RB340 regulator, a Lucas coil, either 25D or 45D distributor, a DR3 wiper motor, 5FL flasher, and a range of switchgear. So the vision of achieving American standards of productivity and volume were seen to be being delivered. However, there were some downsides to this. By 1969, although 700,000 sets of car electrical equipment were supplied, these were essentially to the 1950s specifications. And Lucas also gave OEMs, vehicle manufacturers, incentives that if they bought a complete car set of electrical equipment, which Lucas supplied, they get a cost advantage. So here was Lucas selling nearly 1 million sets of car equipment a year to 1950s type specifications. Prices had come down to an absolute minimum. And therefore, both from the customer and from Lucas, there was no great incentive to improve performance and reliability. And I think it's this scenario that created the situation where cars built with this equipment, maybe for the next 10 years and supplied to North America, were seen to be substantially less reliable than their peers in that market, and led to the Lucas reputation and the Lucas jokes that we talked about earlier. Now, by the late 70s, Ford and Vauxhall in the UK had resourced most of their components away from Lucas because of this, but British Leyland continued to specify them. And that legend of unreliability persisted until the 1980s. And that was really brought up to date when the Japanese OEMs came to the UK and also started taking controlling interest in Rover with the tie-up with Honda. And by the end of the 80s, Lucas had achieved sign-off for their products to be specified on all the Japanese transplants. Now, in a memorable own goal of Lucas marketing, they announced this as saying they were now able to supply products both to meet Japanese and European quality standards, which was not exactly the most beneficial way of exploiting this successful message. Now, while this had been going on, Lucas had still been making cycle parts, bells, pumps, and what have you. But by the 1970s, it pulled out of cyclalities. But their swan song really came in 1969 when Lucas provided this rather streamlined space age bell on the right for the Rally Chopper, which was quite an appropriate swan song for the cycle aspect of the business. But at its peak, Lucas was supplying 1 million bicycle bells a year to Japan and 1 million to Hercules cycles alone. Remarkable, really. Now, back to the automotive side. And in the 1960s, Lucas invented and patented the digitally mapped ignition system. The inventors, Andrew Ives, Mike Copps, and Duncan Hodgson, I mention them in name because I had the privilege of working with all three of them on different projects. Great guys. And on the right's a picture of the US patent. Now, the implications of being able to provide a 3D ignition map were either not appreciated by Lucas management or seen as a potential threat against their distributor business. So instead of seizing this opportunity and developing products to exploit it, they actually developed a testbed tool using this approach. So you could buy this Lucas test set, you could put it on your test bed, you could produce an optimized 3-dimensional map of your ignition system, and then you had to take it back to a conventional distributor and approximate that on 2 straight lines. It seems absolutely mad now, and it seemed mad at the time. But the competitors clearly saw the advantage straight away and started licensing this technology from Lucas, and then went on to develop production applications and integrated fuel control as part of the integrated engine management system. And because of this lack of foresight or whatever reason, Lucas really was relegated to a niche player in the engine management system market. It's a real opportunity lost. We've been first and we ended up really absolutely on the sidelines. Now, when I talked to a senior Lucas guy in the early 80s about this, I said, you know, why, what have you? And he just smiled and said, well, you know, we receive $1 for every car that General Motors sells on royalties. And that was a bit of a poke in the eye, because that is sort of significant of some of the Lucas thinking that, well, okay, we're making money out of it, but we've sort of squandered our heritage going forward. So a bit of a disappointment and a real opportunity lost, but a very important breakthrough for Lucas at the time and something we shouldn't forget. Now, I've talked about Lucas and its acquisition of various companies, and by the 1970s, it had become a very complex, convoluted, with no clear marketing image, brand image. And here I've just picked a number of different companies that, not necessarily all at the same time, but were or could become part of the Lucas Group. We've seen some of these already, Butlers and Hobsons and Rists, but there are some names here that probably are less familiar. If you look down at the bottom left, Door Instruments, they made stroboscopes. That was their forte in those days. I'm not sure why Lucas had them, but they did. Ledex was an American manufacturer of solenoid controlled switchgear. NSF, based in Keighley in Yorkshire, manufactured switchgear and also television tuners. Western Gear at the top, a manufacturer of helicopter gearboxes for the North American military and civil helicopter business. We'll come back to them later. They had a very significant role in the end of the Lucas story. To the right, Siliconics, an American semiconductor manufacturer, which at one time Lucas had a significant interest in. Dusselier below, the French, almost equivalent to Lucas in France, where Lucas had I think a 49% holding. So there was a lot of activity out there that was down to Lucas, but was not identified with Lucas. And so in 1974, there was a rebranding of Lucas, corporate rebranding across the whole business, and introduced this banner here, which was used at this level for Lucas Industries, but also suffixed by either Automotive or Aerospace or some of the brands. But this was applied widely thereafter and became a very recognizable brand. And if you go out today and buy some Lucas products, which are still available, then you'll find that branding is still current and widely used. But going back to the 1980s, for some of the reasons I've already described, the Lucas electrical products were becoming uncompetitive, and the lighting, batteries, motors, etc., were either divested or joint ventures were formed with companies that could bring new technology in place. And only the higher technology products such as diesel systems and electric power steering were retained. A consequence of this was the former hub of Lucas Electrical, Great King Street, where a lot of these products, now obsolete, had been made, had become hopelessly inefficient. They were manufacturing on 7 different floors. There were forklift trucks and goods elevators between the various floors, lots of work in progress. And after an analysis of the Lucas electrical business, it was clear that Great King Street had no place in the 1980s and going forward. And it was subsequently vacated. That was a very significant and perhaps negative event for many of the long-term Lucas employees, because Lucas Great King Street really had signified what Lucas was. It was the headquarters and the major manufacturing plant, but its time had come and gone. This is Great King Street in the late 1970s. You can see the new corporate identity just between the entrance gates there. If you remember that slide I showed early on, the aerial view of King Street, where it was located in the middle of a built-up area, by this time, by the mid-80s, it was now standing in almost a parkland. The slum clearance programs of the 1960s had cleared all that housing away. And now Lucas Great King Street was really standing there in the middle of this now quite white and pleasant open space. But it was time to move on. And by the late 1980s, the wrecking balls were in. And the contractor had estimated it would take 6 months to demolish the plant. In fact, it was so substantially built to support the work that was carried out there that it took significantly longer than that. But the end was inevitable, and is a shot taken by Birmingham Post partway through that process. But the 1980s did raise the opportunity for new businesses. And one of these was Lucas Electrical Electronics and Systems. Now, this brought Smiths Instruments back into a relationship with Lucas. Since the 1930s, Smiths had been the supplier of the instruments for most British car manufacturers, either under their own brand or as British AGR. And Smiths and Lucas had an understanding again on traditional instrument sales. Essentially, as Lucas took over companies during the period, if they had instrumentation business, that was passed on to Smiths. Similarly, if Smiths bought a business and it had products that were compatible with Lucas, they were passed over to Lucas. And so there'd been this partitioning where Smiths had specialised in instrumentation and Lucas on most of the other electrical products. But by the 1980s, many new suppliers were competing in the market. Veglia from Italy, Nippon Seiki, Japan, Valeo from France, and Delco from America. And features and functions were being added to instruments through the use of electronics. And Smiths were becoming marginalised, even with its former BMC customers, because they were still just supplying traditional electromechanical, or with some electronics in, like tachometers and so forth. Also at the time, both Lucas and Smiths found themselves competing with each other on the new Jaguar XJ40 business. And therefore it was decided that perhaps they should combine their expertise to form a new company, and that was Lee's, Lucas Electrical Electronics and Systems. Equity was 80% Lucas and 20% Smiths. They had been promoting DC electroluminescent technology for displays. Ultimately, this proved to be a blind alley, but it gave them a very visible technology attraction and established their credentials operating in this system, in this system area. But the basic business was mechanical instrument packs like this at the top right here, primarily for Austin Rover, some vacuum fluorescence and LED packs, again for Austin Rover, Jaguar, and I'll talk about these in detail. Now, the Lucas Electrical Electronics and Systems instrumentation business was moved from Cricklewood, where traditionally Smiths had made their instruments, to a former Smiths watch factory in Ystrad in South Wales. And these were the products on the right that were manufactured here. This isn't actually a Smiths Lee's instrument pack, but this style of pack was termed the RAT pack. It was a rationalized instrument pack that could be built in a modular form for Rover, and by using different modules within it, could be appropriate for anything from a Maestro van to a top-level Rover by combining these different functions and features in one pack. Unfortunately, it proved to be very expensive to tool and quite inefficient to manufacture, although technically it was a successful product. But they did have a sort of halo product, because just after the formation of Lee's was the launch of the Austin Maestro with the famous talking dash and electronic instrument. And this is the instrument here. It was called Pi 10, and you can see it's quite a hybrid. On the left, we have a vacuum fluorescent analog tachometer, below analog fuel and temperature gauges. On the right, a 7-segment digital speedometer, but then in the center, incandescent bulb warning lights and an electromechanical odometer driven by a stepper motor. So while it was a step forward, it was very much a halfway house and a bit of a compromise. It was also a very powerful lesson teacher, which was that any part of a system is only as good as the weakest part. So, as we'll all remember, the talking dash introduced the mellifluous tones of Nicolette Mackenzie, who had the habit of telling us our doors were open when in fact they weren't. And this was down to the fact that when you're integrating a sophisticated and sensitive electronic instrument with a 10p unsealed courtesy light switch telling that the door is open, it's perhaps not surprising that every time it rained, you got false warnings. And in fact, the real opportunity of sending a powerful message about the Lee's capability in the area was spoilt by the reputation of this trip computer and talking instrument, because it was giving all these false messages. And unfortunately, that would prove damaging, because when we look down here at the bottom, this was the successor, initially introduced on the Montego, and you can see this is now a full LCD display. Also, it is fully electronic, and it's overcome all the problems of the earlier system. But by now, the damage had been done, and I think it was a blow from which Lees never really recovered. Also, there was a debacle with Fiat. Based on the original success of Lees in the instrumentation business, they were awarded a contract to develop an electronic instrument for the top level Fiat Tipo. But because of some of the other problems, Lucas decided to pull out of this business and left Fiat high and dry. And I have some personal experience of this, because I was driving a car from Geneva to Turin to develop some Lucas high technology systems. And while I was driving there, they had a notification, this cancelled order for the instrumentation. And when I got there, having driven 3 days over from the UK to Turin, essentially I got the bum rush told to turn around and drive straight back again, which is what I actually did. So that was a bit of a debacle for us as well. What did come out of this successfully was this instrumentation at the bottom. This was the Jaguar XJ40 instrument pack, which had some patented Lucas design air-cooled instruments. Very successful, but because of the failure of the conventional instrument business, Lucas actually decided to withdraw from it. So this rat pack type business was sold on to Kanto Seiki, a Japanese supplier. We withdrew from the more advanced electronic business. What was left of the traditional separate instruments was sold on initially to VDO, and then secondarily to Kaiwatt Instruments, where it continues operating successfully today. So Lees was an opportunity lost, I think, unfortunate for us all. Another opportunity lost was on automotive anti-locking braking systems. Lucas had got a lot of experience in ABS, particularly in the railway market, where they provided ABS for the advanced passenger train. But they made a strategic error, believing it would only feature as an option on high-end cars. And that allowed Bosch, who don't actually make brakes at all, to become the market leader in ABS and subsequent development into integrated chassis systems. Lucas entered late into the market with an electronic system, then abandoned it and went on to market a mechanical system called SCS. Now, 1986 was a key year. Ford introduced ABS as standard on the then new Granada. And while it was a relatively high-end vehicle for Ford, it wasn't the prestige vehicle that Lucas had anticipated, would be the only takers of ABS. So here we had Ford entering a volume market with ABS, supplied by Alfred Davis, ATE, but would subsequently taken over by Continental. Now, in 1986, Lucas also offered their system, SCS, as an option on Ford Escort and Orion. It was a mechanical system, belt-driven off the drive shafts. It used a combination of flywheels and overrun clutches to provide the ABS function. And it was a relatively successful system in terms of it functioned reasonably well. But it was clearly a blind alley. It was going nowhere. You couldn't really integrate it with any more extensive or sophisticated chassis systems. And again, Lucas made what I consider to be a real blunder in advertising the system, because they said, and I paraphrase it, compared with an electronic system, you get 80% of the benefits for 20% of the cost. Well, if you're selling a safety system, who wants 80% of the safety when you could have 100%? So I think, again, another own goal for Lucas marketing at that time. But Lucas's failure to provide an anti-locking braking system was really summarized below by Ken McKeever, one of the MDs of Lucas Braking Systems. He said it was one of the worst mistakes in the history of the company. It threw away its birthright on ABS. And he actually went on to say, we should have sold another company to pay for this. In fact, this situation wasn't really resolved to the very last days of Lucas, when the Varity side of the business brought in Kelsey Hayes, an ABS supplier in the US, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Big success from the 1980s was EPIC, developed by CAV, the electronically programmed injection control. This was an inline pump with electronic control. It introduced drive-by-wire for Lucas for the first time, and it controlled fuel volume and timing much more precisely than previous mechanical fuel injection pumps. It also controlled the induction air heater for cold starting, had an exhaust gas recirculation control system, and anti-theft. I mean, on previous diesel systems, provided you could crank the engine and open the fuel rack, the engine would run, and made them very prone to theft. By building electronic control into this fuel injection system, a very effective anti-theft feature could be incorporated. It's also included for the first time Laser 2000, a diagnostic system that went on to be developed and applied to a wide range of Lucas products by the end of that decade. And this product was very successful, used by Ford, PSA, VW, and LDV, amongst others. So a big success for Lucas in this area. Now, on the back of that, it was seen that even further benefits could be achieved on diesel system injection by going to electronic unit injectors, EUI. The principle is shown here on the left. Rather than having a centralized pump, we now have an injection pump, camshaft driven, an individual one for each cylinder. And that is controlled by a solenoid device here. Clearly, there's a pre-delivery pump and so forth. I won't go into that at the moment. And the idea is by having this very local control of pressure and the very short path to injection, you're taking out all the timing delays that are potential, the panting of pipes and joints and what have you, to improve both the use of higher injection pressure and avoidance of leaks and shock waves and so forth. And Lucas, through Lucas research actually, developed a very class-leading version of this system for passenger cars. Here's the Land Rover TD5 Storm injector that was put into volume production. And here's the control solenoid. I called it a colonoid here because that was the name Lucas devised for it, by a very special design of solenoid winding. They were able to provide a much more precise control of that fuel delivery than a conventional solenoid used in a very similar system that was offered by Bosch. And so here, another real success for Lucas at that time. In fact, by 1995, Lucas had its bigger ever contract. This is extract from Lucas Automotive News, the biggest ever contract for diesel engines supplied to Volkswagen in Germany, worth £150 million a year. Going to the bottom, it's EUI. It's been used in trucks since 1988 and now being introduced into the car and van market. Chief Executive George Simpson, who we'll come to later, said the deal signaled the introduction of new technology from commercials into the car and van market. So at that time, seemed to be another really significant step forward for Lucas in the diesel injection business. Again, we'll come back to this because it had some unexpected outcomes. Lucas was also very much ahead of its time in thinking. On the left is Lucas plug-in hybrid. This was designed by Ogle, and the storage and control and traction system supplied by a combination of Lucas and Chloride. It wasn't developed with the view of Lucas going into car manufacture at all, but rather as a test bed to develop control systems, understand strategies, and test the powertrain. And so very much ahead of its time. In fact, that car is still in existence. It was sold on eBay relatively recently, but very indicative of the fact that the forward thinking that was coming out of Lucas and the research group at that time. Similarly, on pure electric vehicles, Lucas introduced a number of short volume manufactured electric vehicles, either in conjunction with Bedford, the CF electric vehicle you see here, and with Leyland DAF, again as test beds for evaluating and demonstrating Lucas control systems. So a company looking very much to the future. The same was seen in Lucas Aerospace. Lucas introduced FADEC, fully autonomous digital engine controls, and LUCOL, a language that was used to program these units. Perhaps at that time, people didn't realize electronics were being introduced to control flight systems and engine controls on aircraft. And Lucas were really leaders in this area here. You can see here a FADEC ECU, highly ruggedized. And even though this is a late version, you can see on the side here, this test label, Goodrich, who were one of the successors to Lucas Aerospace. It's clearly still Lucas branded, and you can see the LUCOL software reference number here. Now, why do I mention LUCOL? Well, as now, and even more so then, perhaps the concept of running an aircraft on software might cause some concerns when we know what software tends to do in terms of crashing and so forth. So LUCOL was developed by Lucas for this purpose. LUCOL stands for the Lucas Control Language, and it was a language that was very easy to convert from flowcharts into the actual program, because the structure was very much replicated the flowchart. So up here you can see a fuel control system flowchart. Here's the Lucas logic, LUCOL logic area. And for each of these modules, LUCOL had a pre-developed and pre-validated module, which could be picked and incorporated in this structure very easily. Now, it was also a deterministic language, so it had no jumps, it had no interrupts, it had standard instruction lengths. And so it was relatively easy to prove mathematically that this was a highly reliable program, and therefore suitable and could be demonstrable to reach the levels of reliability necessary to be validated on aircraft. So again, a very big success for Lucas as a technology leader in FADEC for engines on aircraft. Now, moving on to the 1990s, the situation in the automotive industry specifically was changing. We were moving away from component suppliers to systems integrators. And a lot of the OEMs were going that way. And they were saying, why buy brakes, wheels, tires, struts, for example, from different suppliers and integrate them? If we would go to one supplier who would provide that whole corner module, there would be benefits in terms of weight and cost optimization, functional integration, and simplifying the supply chain. Also, it put a lot of the R&D activity away from the vehicle manufacturer and to the suppliers. And here's a number of the most significant players at that time. Bosch, the most successful independent European-based one. Delphi, part of the GM group that's serving global customers. Visteon, similarly for Ford. Continental is a good example, who had changed very rapidly over not too long a period of years from a tire and hose manufacturer to a supplier of high-end technology projects driven by the opportunity of systems integration. And then from the Japanese side, we had Nippon Denso and Sumitomo, both with Keiretsu relationships with Japanese OEMs, but also serving global customers. And Valeo, the major French independent supplier of parts. So these were developing into system suppliers and system integrators in the 1990s. And there was a clear aspiration for Lucas to move in the same direction. And the opportunity really came in 1994 when Lucas's final CEO, George Simpson, joined the company. He succeeded Tony Gill as the first CEO from outside of Lucas, and he'd recently turned the Rover Group round and arranged its sale to BMW. He joined with an anticipated tenure of up to 10 years and continued the program of divestment of non-core businesses. Now, one of the things he did inherit was the Lucas Western crisis. I think I mentioned Lucas Western when I talked about the different brands. And this was a situation where it turned out that because of the failure to apply a number of quality control measures in the manufacture of gearboxes for the US military, Lucas was prosecuted. And there's a whole story there to tell, which clearly I can't today. But at a cost of $149 million, the first year of Simpson's tenure was highly focused on getting them out of that really difficult situation, including threats of prosecution from the FBI and so forth. By the way, I should say testing showed there was nothing actually wrong with the gearboxes, but it was simply the failure to follow the prescribed processes and documentation that caused the problem to occur. But one thing that he did institute was strategic planning, supporting the formation of a partnership for Lucas to become a systems integrator rather than remaining a component supplier. And a number of options were considered: Tube Investments, Turner & Newell, Verity, GKN and Valeo. Verity appeared to be the best fit. This was because, as I mentioned earlier, Verity brought with them Kelsey Hayes, who were the biggest supplier of ABS systems in North America. And so along with Girling, put Lucas in a very powerful position for supplying complete braking systems. And also Perkins Engines came, and it was seen that Perkins and Lucas diesel systems could again add value to each other and take the company forward. It wasn't actually known at the time that when this was being negotiated, Verity was also trying to sell Perkins Engines to Caterpillar, which they subsequently did. But Verity appeared to be the best fit. Now, the other thing that Simpson introduced was technology route mapping. This was an interesting process that combined intelligence from engineers, from salesmen, from competitors, from our customers to try and decide what technology would be needed in the future. A very effective process. A number of years ago, I found some of the paperwork from this and compared it with what had actually happened. And everything we predicted had come to pass. So a very powerful process. But one of the things that came out of that was a conclusion that diesel EUI was a blind alley and that common rail systems were the direction for the future. And that turned out to be absolutely right. But as a consequence, Lucas cancelled its bigger ever order, the order from Volkswagen for the EUI systems, leaving them somewhat disgruntled. And as a consequence, Bosch had the opportunity to supply its slightly inferior Pumperdusa system on every small VW diesel for the next 10 years. So again, a bit of a disappointing outcome for Lucas on what should have been a huge success for them. So Verity seemed to be the preferred partner, but it brought some worrying baggage with it. Verity had actually been formed from the ashes of Massey Ferguson, and I'm not going to go into that story as well, but these are some quotes from the time. And it was seen that both Verity and its CEO, Victor Rice, had got quite a lot of bad press. And I think this was because Verity, although Rice is an Englishman, the management style was much more North American, so much more profit focused, much more aggressive than was perhaps comfortable for the Lucas tradition. So there was some worrying baggage that came with Verity, and there were some board concerns. There was general support from the value, but concern about the people. Battles with Victor Rice about power. Sir Alistair Morton, who was on the Lucas board, expressed his opposition to the appointment of Rice. It was the worst year of my life, no one to talk to, no one to trust. So this was the Lucas board talking, and these were from minutes of meetings. But despite these reservations, the merger with Verity went ahead. And Lucas Verity PLC was formed in May 1996, ostensibly a key player in braking and diesel systems, within the top 10 global systems integrators, domiciled in the UK. Lucas owned 60% of the equity and had the majority on the board. George Simpson left and went on to join GEC, and Victor Rice succeeded him. It appeared to have been a successful outcome for Lucas. However, what happened next was that, as well as Simpson, two former Lucas directors resigned at the time of the merger, and by the end of '96, four more Lucas directors had resigned, all replaced by former associates of Rice from Verity. At the same time, shareholder equity moved 60% US based, and a prompted attempt to change the domicile. It was seen that more financial advantage and leverage could be obtained operating in the US market than in the UK. And so this was highly supported and promoted, moving to a US domicile. What actually happened was that when it came to the vote, it failed. The major institutions opposed it. And although the outcome was that Lucas Verity actually said it's business as usual, clearly changed direction, and activities were commenced which saw Victor Rice seeking to dispose of Lucas Faraday after a life of under 3 years. And again, some of the same names were raised in terms of potential parties buying it: Turbine Investments, Morelli, Denso, TRW, and so on. Ultimately, TRW then bought Lucas Faraday for £4 billion in May 1999. So really bringing an end to the Lucas story. And that was one of the biggest transactions that had taken place of this sort at the time. So what happened? Well, Lucas Faraday was essentially broken up, and a number of the companies, parts of Lucas Faraday, ended up here. So the Joseph Lucas company, the holding company, was taken over by TRW and ZF. Lucas Electrical was split up between Magneti Marelli, Denso, and Carello. Electronics and Systems went to Prestolite and TRW. So you can see that there was a major breakup of the Lucas group. The ones I've described here in green are areas where there is still nonetheless some activity in the UK of the companies that followed up from Lucas. So not all was lost in terms of the manufacturing base in Lucas. And also these in blue here, Lucas Electrical and Lucas Diesel Systems, they're actually new companies licensed by the brand owner, which is now ZF, operating and selling the Lucas products. And I showed a number of those earlier. So Lucas has a brand, has re-emerged and continues to exist. It's not a company even in the shadow of its former self, but there is still quite a lot of manufacturing and design activity in the UK, which are legacies of Lucas. So that's some consolation, I think, for me and some of the others. Just possibly indicative of the sad end of all of this, this is a Lucas Research Centre today, now emptied. It's probably the last significant building left in the Birmingham area that was a Lucas site. Latterly, the Lucas headquarters, then TRW UK and ZF, up for sale for Bellway Homes. I suppose we should feel some happiness that they're actually going to call the development Lucas Green, but rather a sad end to a very important element of the Lucas story. But there are legacies. There are engine and flight control systems on aircraft. Even today, high-speed trains use Lucas-derived wheel slide protection systems, although I think they're now manufactured by Knorr-Bremse. The EUI fuel injection systems were sold on to Delphi, and I think now are with Borg-Warner. EPAS was a very major success story, and electric power steering is now fitted to most, at least small cars that you buy these days. And so if I look at this range of technology developed by Lucas, you can see today that they still have wide applications, both in the automotive, aircraft, and even the rail industry. So not without positive consequences for all of us in the business. And as I say, the brand is still going. Here's a range of products that you can buy today. There's a Lucas product probably in most of the automotive sectors that you recognize. So ignition systems, wiring, pump switches, and also a range of garage equipment, diagnostic equipment, which again, previously Lucas had moved into. So again, some compensation. I think when I go down to my local motor factor to buy bits for my car, if I can see something with Lucas on it, I tend to buy it, even though it's probably actually a brand rather than a genuine Lucas legacy. But it still, again, also has an international presence. So still something positive from the Lucas perspective. So coming to the end, just to end on a perhaps slightly more positive note, do you know what make of batteries fitted to your car? And I'm talking about 12-volt batteries here. Does it matter? Well, probably not. Batteries probably aren't that much of a prominent subject when you're considering buying a car, but in the 1960s and 70s, it was clearly very important. And for a number of years, Lucas actually sponsored the illuminated rocket Blackpool tram. So when I used to visit as a teenager in Blackpool during those days, I was very happy to see this thing going past. And I wonder how many people, as a consequence, bought a Lucas battery because they went on and lasted longer and longer and longer. So just shows how things have changed since those days. And also, the brand lives on. There is still a company in India, Lucas TVS, which is now an independent company. Some of you will probably know that for the last few years, I've actually been working for Bentley. And when I look under the boot of Bentley at the compressor on the air suspension system, I see this, a Lucas TVS compressor motor. So the brand lives on, I'm pleased to say. So on that note, that concludes my presentation, and thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Howard. I must say, we've had a wonderful chat going on here. So there's been a lot of ex-employees of Lucas and a lot of memories.
Right.
I've saved the chat for you so you can have a look later on with a whiskey or whatever. Yeah, we do have a few questions as well, if you're just a few, but we've had a lot of comments in the chat going on and a few questions and a few answers as well.
Right,
so,
excellent, thank you.
A couple of the questions are more comments really, but I will read out a couple of the questions, and we are getting a chat coming in saying absolutely fantastic presentation. Thank you very much, Howard. Really interesting. It was
I've just
really
typed
good.
that one.
Yeah, did you? Typed his own comments. No, it was really good, really riveting. I mean, I've had nothing to do with Lucas, but I found it absolutely. I felt like I was there almost.
Well, I was there, and I have to say, you know, I think I was there with a success for 25 years, and probably for 24 of those, they were excellent. They were the bad times, but they were few and far between. So, yeah. Well,
judging by the comments, there's a lot of good feeling and a lot of happy memories about. Do you remember this person and that person? That's right, yes. And so it does feel like it was a bit of a family going on.
Indeed, yes. Yeah. And, you know, it's even today, I mean, we're all getting on a bit now, but when you go to OEMs and anyone in the automotive business in the UK, certainly, and even abroad, you inevitably bump into people who have worked for Lucas. You know, it's a common link, and we share some memories, hence my ability to pull some of it together in this short presentation.
No, it's excellent. So just to remind everybody, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Carry on using the chat. We'll keep this open for a little while longer. After all of this is over, you can always follow the blog. You can contribute to the blog. The links are in the chat. Ratika has also put some links to the Facebook, to the LinkedIn, and to the Twitter, so you can carry on with that. Unfortunately, we can't answer people who've raised hands. I see we've got a few raised hands. It'd be lovely if we could all have a nice communal chat here, but please just type anything into the Q&A or into the chat. That would be great. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to go through a few questions, which may be comments open to everybody really, but Howard, see what you think for these. Sure. The first one we had was from James. He said, working for Lucas, it was sometimes frustrating that they did not develop the electronic side more. There was real pioneering work in fuel injection, electronic ignition, and semiconductors. So any thoughts on why senior management didn't concentrate more in this area?
My personal view, and I have no real evidence for this, but it is a view, is that unlike, say, some of the competition, like Bosch, for example, or some of the electronic suppliers that were actually part of an OEM group like Delphi or so on, Lucas was a private company. As I said earlier, it was very focused on shareholder value and dividends. And I think they were less prepared to invest in long-term projects where the payback might be only 10 years in the future. I think there were a number of projects which I was aware of where high investment was required, and rather than make that commitment, they decided to pull the plug. And I think it was that reluctance to make long-term commitments, even though they saw the technical and commercial opportunities and the ability of some of the competitors. I mean, some of these Japanese suppliers, for example, Nippon Denso, for example, you know, they would form a relationship with, say, Nissan for some new product that was required in the future. And they'd do an open book cost share. They'd know they wouldn't be getting their money back for 15 years, but it was all part of a business plan. I don't think Lucas ever really was in that sort of advantageous situation, unfortunately. So that's my opinion. As I say, it is just an opinion. I have nothing to actually support that with fact, other than a number of key events where Lucas did pull the plug on projects.
Okay, there are a few, I would say they're more comments really about how British management have made a few wrong decisions in the past, really. Yeah, I mean, it's a question really, it's very open, you know, why do British management make such poor decisions sometimes? That's open to interpretation, of course.
Yeah, I mean,
but it's
a comment rather than a question, I think.
Yeah.
I think if I could have answered that question, I'd be retired in the Bahamas for now on my management consultancy business.
Yes. And actually, it's quite nice. There are people who are answering in the questions with some links there as well about history and looking at technical developments, IBM, Amstrad, etc. Another quick question, quick fire one. Are Lucas batteries manufactured by Lucas or Yoasa?
Neither now. When Lucas formed a joint venture with Yoasa, that was in the 1980s, I think, and that was to primarily bring Japanese levels of technology and manufacturing expertise into Lucas. And the factory at Foreman's Road was upgraded appropriately. When Lucas was broken up at the end of the 90s, Yoasa continued manufacturing batteries, and they kept the Lucas brand for about 5 years, particularly in the aftermarket, because it was seen as a recognizable brand and Yoasa wasn't. But once Yoasa was established, they closed Foreman's Road and moved their operation down to South Wales. Latterly, the Lucas branded batteries are made, I think, by Johnson Controls, which again is a premium battery manufacturer. Now, I say was because Johnson has very recently sold its battery business to I think it's a venture capitalist company. So as of today, I'm not sure whether the successors of JCI make Lucas batteries, but up to about 12 months ago, JCI did, and they were very high quality products.
Alan asks, how much do you think Lucas was a victim of its customers? He remembers Jaguar changing design requirements up to the point of production, frustrating opportunities for pre-production testing.
I think that is probably a factor. I mean, when I did work at Jaguar for a period, and also previously at Rolls-Royce, and both Lucas and Bosch were significant suppliers to both those companies. And it was very clear with Bosch, they told you what was happening. They gave you the spec of a product. They said it would be available in 12 months' time, and it would do this. And in 12 months' time, it appeared and it did that. Lucas would tend to over-promise and under-deliver, but make it worse by accommodating changes. So, you know, it was clear when I worked with Ford, you know, we had some very strict rules. If a new car was being launched, once it was developed, it was launched, unless it either didn't meet legal requirements or it didn't work. What you developed was launched. If there was a problem with it, it was fixed at the next model year update. With the British OEMs, Rover Group and people of that ilk, it was perpetual change. And Lucas, maybe in trying to support them, accommodate them, was a victim of that. So you had products with late changes that weren't properly validated. Tooling wasn't in place as it should be. So that had a significant impact on reliability and quality. So yes, I think the British OEMs were part of that, but I think Lucas could have actually been more rigorous and said, sorry, take it or leave it. I think the other thing was that a lot of the British OEMs, or what became Austin Rover and Rover Group, they often tried to start from scratch every time they developed a new platform. So you'd get a new switch gear, you have new electronics. And I'm talking the latter days after we've moved away from the high volume commodity stuff. And so when Rover developing a new car, there might have been, I don't know, 80% new content. if you looked at a company like Toyota, even though they might be launching a new car, 70% of the content was carryover. And that's why they work by incremental development, building on the reliability and reputation from previous models and delivering the sort of quality and performance that people came to expect. So I think all those are factors, and Lucas was probably party to it and victim of that sort of situation.
Alan also adds, and also the 12,000 mile warranty and the panic when foreign cars had unlimited mileage warranties.
Yes. Well, again, I mean, it was a trait, you know, but in many ways, and it wasn't Lucas, it was the OEMs, but the quality, the criterion for quality was getting through the warranty period. You know, if it got through the 12 months, then hey, you know, we've got some sales business here, some spares business. It perhaps wasn't as cynical as that, but it was certainly a factor. And it certainly was the case that, you know, when we got Lucas product back that was faulty and out of warranty, we perhaps didn't go to the lengths we should have done to learn the lessons from that and improve the product as a result of that, because it was out of warranty. Sold another one.
Just a comment about management, wondering, you know, are engineers ever on the boards when these decisions are actually made?
Yes, a good question. Yeah, not enough of them by the sound of it.
Wonderful. So I think we'll bring that to a close now. Thank you everyone for the chat. There's been some wonderful chats going on. Peter said, knew nothing about Lucas, but feel far more informed now. Just interested in engineering history and how British dominance declined. Extremely interesting talk. Many people who've worked in Lucas. Thanks, Howard. Very nostalgic. Some great examples of British ingenuity and innovation, but also a litany of British management failures. So lessons to be learned there. So excellent. So many thanks to everyone. People have worked in Lucas. Got this from someone who worked at Shaftmore Lane. That makes any.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Rotating machines, yes, and I think I used to visit the publicity department, which is on the top floor. And
oh right.
Yeah.
And quite a few. You know, do you remember certain bosses? I'm just trying to scroll back now to people who've actually found themselves and said, "Oh, did you work in this department? Do you remember this person and that person, etc." So what I'll do is I will save this chat.
Thank you.
We might even look at maybe putting some of it on the blog. As someone said who worked for Lucas, this person, Rob, was at GKS College Road and Lucas Micos, MICOS.
Yes.
Lucas Electrical at Mere Green.
Yes.
AEC Dog Kennel for 2 years. Shirley, Fen End, Holford, and now ZF Blythe Valley.
Right. Well, there again, I mean, just all those names, all those sites, how nostalgic. I mean, I've not mentioned most of those. I mean, you know, Fen End, you know, we had a test track there for developing chassis systems and braking. You know, a huge facility that's probably not many people other than those who work there would even be aware of. Yeah, I mean, even Lucas Micos, I mean, I'd not even remembered Lucas Micos until just now. So there you go. I mean, it really does bring these things home to you, yes. And
I'll just talk over here so people can hear me because the mic's actually on the computer.
Right.
It's all right. My father was a motor mechanic, says Suzanne Bucknell, and assigned to attend a do given by Lucas at a hotel in Torquay in the 1950s. And she said, what I remember is father bringing home a slab of chocolate molded in the shape of the Lucas log, the one with the lion and the flaming torch.
Yes. Well, when the Lucas branding, corporate branding was formed in 1974, there was a lot of sadness about the Lucas lion and the staff and the flambeau. It was seen as a loss of our heritage, you know. But as I said, the rebranding actually was a success, and you know, it continues to this day. So But yes, I rather like the old Lion.
Mm. Ken was a graduate trainee, intake of 1973, toured departments such as APAD at GKS, Mere Green, Fueling and Control, MTD, College Road. Bailed out in 1974 though, got out. Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much for the chat.
Well, thank you all for listening.
Yeah, I will save this and have a nice rest of your evening, everybody. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I will just leave it on here. There we go. And end it. End webinar for all.